Listen closely because what I'm about to tell you isn't some Hollywood fairy tale. This is the raw, brutal truth about a boy who had nothing, risked everything, and became something the entire city of Bakersfield would never forget. This is the story of how an invisible ghost became an untouchable phantom, and how one act of courage in a dirty alleyway changed the balance of power in a town that had forgotten what justice looked like. Bakersfield, California, October 14th, a Tuesday that would be etched into the city's memory forever. The heat that morning wasn't just uncomfortable. It was oppressive, pushing down on your shoulders like the weight of broken dreams and dried up opportunities. The kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and made men do desperate things. For 16-year-old Dalton Reed, that heat was just another layer of the invisible blanket that had covered him for the past 2 years. Dalton woke that morning the same way he'd woken every morning for 732 days. In the back seat of a rusted-out 1992 Ford Bronco, parked at the edge of the rail yards, where the city pretended people like him didn't exist. The sun was already brutal at 6 in the morning, turning the metal shell into an oven. His body was covered in a thin sheen of sweat that mixed with the dust and grime that seemed to be a permanent part of his skin now. He sat up slowly, his back protesting from sleeping on the torn vinyl seats. His breakfast was half a granola bar he'd saved from yesterday's dumpster run and water from a plastic bottle he'd refilled at the public park fountain. Not exactly the breakfast of champions, but it was fuel, and fuel meant survival. Dalton Reed was what the city called invisible. Not because he had superpowers or some magical ability. Invisible because society had decided long ago that homeless teenagers weren't worth seeing. He was 5'9", lean to the point of being scrawny, with brown hair that fell into his sharp gray eyes. His clothes were a patchwork of thrift store finds and donated items from church bins. His shoes were held together with duct tape and prayer. But those those eyes saw everything. When you're invisible, you develop a particular set of skills. You learn to read environments the way a soldier reads a battlefield. The heavy, aggressive footsteps of a bored cop looking to bust someone for loitering. The frantic, twitchy movements of an addict looking for their next fix. The arrogant, entitled swagger of rich kids who treated the world like a playground built specifically for their amusement. Dalton had learned all of these languages. Survival depended on it. By 7:30 that morning, he'd washed his face and hands in the public restroom at the old gas station on Baker Street. The attendant knew him by now, gave him a nod, but never called the cops. Small mercies in a merciless world. Dalton brushed his teeth with a toothbrush he'd shoplifted from the dollar store, trying to maintain some shred of dignity in a life that had stripped most of it away. His destination that morning, like most mornings, was North High School. Not because he attended. Dalton had been a ghost in the system since he ran away from the group home in Fresno 2 years ago. No, he went to North High because the dumpster behind the cafeteria was a gold mine. Rich kids threw away more food in a day than Dalton ate in a week. Unopened granola bars, half-eaten sandwiches from kids who didn't know what real hunger felt like. Sometimes, if he was lucky, entire lunches barely touched because some teenager decided they weren't hungry after all. But Dalton went to North High for another reason too, though he'd never admit it out loud. There was a cracked concrete bench near the perimeter of the school, partially hidden by an overgrown oleander bush. From that bench, Dalton could see the student parking lot, the main entrance, and the alleyway that cut behind the old abandoned bowling alley next door. From that bench, Dalton could observe the world he'd been forced out of, and he could read. Clutched in his weathered backpack was his most prized possession, a battered, water-stained copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. He'd found it 8 months ago in one of those little free library boxes in the wealthy neighborhood on the north side of town. Someone's Cast-Off, Dalton's Salvation. He'd read it cover to cover 11 times now. The story of Edmond Dantes, the sailor who was wrongly imprisoned, who spent years planning his escape, who transformed himself from victim to avenger. That story spoke to something deep in Dalton's chest. The idea that someone could be crushed by the world, buried alive by injustice, and still claw their way back to power. On that particular October morning, Dalton sat on his bench with the book resting on his knees, but his eyes weren't focused on the yellowed pages. They were locked on the parking lot, specifically on a girl, Scarlett Maddox. To anyone else passing by, Scarlett was just another high school sophomore trying to blend into the background. She wore ripped jeans, black Converse sneakers, and a plain white tank top. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Nothing remarkable about her at first glance. But Dalton Reed hadn't survived 2 years on the streets by looking at first glances. Scarlett walked differently than the other girls, where they moved with the carefree bounce of youth and privilege. Scarlett moved with purpose. Her shoulders were slightly squared, her chin tucked down, her eyes constantly scanning. That was the walk of someone who'd been trained to be aware. That was the walk of someone who understood that danger didn't always announce itself. And then there was the jacket. Even in the 90-degree October heat that had Bakersfield sweating buckets, Scarlett carried a heavy black leather jacket draped over her arm. Not the thin fashion store leather that teenage girls wore to look edgy. This was thick, scarred, road-worn leather. The kind that had seen highways and hard miles. The kind that smelled of motor oil and exhaust and freedom. Dalton had noticed the jacket 3 weeks ago, and more importantly, he'd noticed the small silver pin on the collar. A death's head. The skull grinning with that particular menace that told you exactly what world it came from. Motorcycle club, heavy hitters, the kind of people who didn't play by civilian rules. Scarlett Maddox was trying desperately to be invisible just like Dalton, but for different reasons. She was hiding from something, or maybe hiding something. And she'd caught the attention of exactly the wrong person. Carson Whitmore. If Bakersfield had royalty, Carson Whitmore was the crown prince. 17 years old, 6 feet tall, athletic build, sandy blonde hair styled with the kind of casual perfection that cost money. He drove a brand new lifted white Chevrolet Silverado that his father had bought him for his 16th birthday. The truck cost more than most people in Bakersfield made in a year. Carson was the king of North High School through sheer financial force. His father, Preston Whitmore, was one of the most prominent real estate developers in Kern County. Shopping centers, housing developments, commercial properties. The Whitmore name was plastered on half the buildings in town, and Carson had learned from his father that money bought everything, including people. For the past 3 weeks, Dalton had watched from his invisible perch as Carson tried to corner Scarlett. It had started as arrogant flirting. Carson assumed a girl like Scarlett, quiet and solitary, would be thrilled to get attention from the school's golden boy. He'd approach her in the parking lot, lean against her locker, show up wherever she was trying to study in peace. But Scarlett had ignored him. When ignoring didn't work, she told him in no uncertain terms to back off. Dalton hadn't been close enough to hear the exact words, but he'd seen Carson's face that day. The flash of genuine anger, the flush of red across his privileged cheeks, the clenching of his fists. In Carson's world, the word no was a foreign language. It was an insult to his ego. It was unacceptable. And now, 3 weeks later, Dalton could see that the tension was about to snap. Carson had escalated. He'd started bringing backup. His enforcer, Trent Garrison, was a thick-necked football player who'd been held back twice and saw high school as his kingdom before the real world chewed him up. And Jessica Lang, a sharp-tongued girl who treated cruelty like a competitive sport and documented everything on her phone. The three of them had circled Scarlett like sharks for days, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. On that Tuesday, October 14th, at exactly 3:45 in the afternoon, the final bell rang. The sound vomited a stream of teenagers out into the blinding sunlight. Dalton watched as Scarlett adjusted her backpack straps, put her head down, and started walking quickly away from the main exit. She was taking her usual shortcut, down the narrow alley that ran behind the abandoned strike zone bowling alley. The route cut her walk home in half, but it was also a blind spot. No cameras, no witnesses. Dalton's stomach tightened, that cold, familiar knot of dread that had kept him alive for 2 years. And then he saw it. Carson's white Silverado rolled out of the parking lot. But instead of heading toward the wealthy subdivisions where he lived, it crept slowly toward the alley entrance. Trent was in the passenger seat, that cruel smirk already on his face. Jessica was in the back phone, raised and ready. They were hunting. Every survival instinct Dalton had developed over 732 days on the streets screamed at him to look away, to close his book, to walk in the opposite direction. Involvement meant police. Police meant questions. Questions meant the system, and the system meant juvenile detention or another group home, or worse. Stay invisible, ghost. Mind your business. Survive another day. But as Dalton watched that truck turn down the access road, blocking the opposite end of the alley, a memory crashed through his mental defenses like a wrecking ball. He was 12 years old again, in a dark hallway in Fresno, listening to his foster sister crying, watching a man with heavy hands and bourbon breath advancing, being too small, too weak, too scared to do anything but hide. The system had separated them after that night. He'd never seen her again. Never got to apologize for being a coward. Dalton closed his book. Edmond Dantes had spent 14 years in a prison cell waiting for his chance to act. Dalton had spent 2 years in a different kind of prison, the prison of invisibility, the prison of powerlessness. Not today. He slipped the book into his threadbare backpack, stood up from the concrete bench, and started walking toward the alley. He didn't have a plan, didn't have a weapon, didn't have backup. All he had was a sickening certainty that if he walked away from this, he'd be walking away from the last shred of his humanity. The alley behind the strike zone bowling alley smelled like every forgotten corner of Bakersfield. Rotting cardboard, stale urine, spilled motor oil, and sun-baked garbage. The buildings on either side rose like canyon walls, trapping the heat and the stench. The asphalt was cracked and buckled from years of neglect, weeds pushing through like nature's middle finger to human civilization. By the time Dalton slipped quietly around the corner, pressing his back against the rough brick wall, still warm from the afternoon sun, the confrontation was already escalating. Carson had parked the Silverado diagonally, completely blocking Scarlett's path. He was leaning against the chrome grille, arms crossed, wearing that entitled smile that rich boys wore when they knew the world would bend to their will. Trent stood a few feet away, cracking his knuckles. A cliché, but an intimidating one given his size. He was easily 6'2" and outweighed Dalton by at least 80 pounds of linebacker muscle. Jessica was leaning out the back window, phone held up high, recording. Always recording. Evidence or entertainment, or both. Dalton edged closer, using the shadows and the dumpsters for cover. Old habits from street life. Be invisible. Observe first. The voices echoed off the brick walls. I don't get it, Scarlett. Carson's voice was smooth, practiced like he'd rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror. I invite you to the lake house. I offer to introduce you to people who actually matter in this dust bowl of a town. And you treat me like trash. Do you know who my father is? Scarlett's voice was steady, though Dalton could see her hands trembling slightly where she gripped the straps of her backpack. I don't care who your father is, Carson. Move the truck. Let me pass. Trent stepped forward, invading her space. Or what you gonna call your trailer park family? You think wearing dirty leather makes you tough? From his position behind the dumpster, Dalton saw Scarlett take a step back. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. There wasn't one. Carson's truck blocked one end. The brick walls were too high to climb. The only exit was through Trent, and that wasn't happening. You have no idea what you're messing with, Scarlett said softly. It wasn't an empty threat. There was something chilling in her certainty, a warning from someone who knew exactly what consequences looked like. But Carson and Trent were blinded by their own arrogance, insulated by money and privilege, and the belief that nothing bad could ever happen to people like them. Carson pushed off the truck, sauntering closer. Grab her bag, Trent. Let's see what she's so defensive about. Trent lunged. Scarlett tried to dodge, but Trent was fast. He grabbed the strap of her backpack and yanked hard, pulling her forward. She stumbled, couldn't catch herself, fell hard onto the unforgiving asphalt. The sound of her knees and palms hitting the ground made Dalton flinch. Scrapes immediately bloomed red on her skin. Her leather jacket spilled from her arms where she'd been carrying it. Trent kicked it away. It landed in a dirty puddle of oil and standing water. Carson laughed, actually laughed. Not so tough, now are we? And something inside Dalton Reed broke. Not broke like shattered glass. Broke like a dam that had been holding back a flood for 2 years. All the rage, all the helplessness, all the nights sleeping in fear, all the days being invisible while the world walked past like he didn't exist. All the memories of being too small to protect someone who needed protecting. It all came rushing out. Hey, Dalton's voice cracked slightly before finding its volume. The word echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot. 3 heads turned. Carson, Trent, and Scarlett all stared at the scrawny, disheveled teenager stepping out of the shadows. Dalton's clothes were ragged. His jeans had holes that weren't fashionable. His gray t-shirt was faded and too big. His shoes were held together with duct tape, but his fists were clenched at his sides and his gray eyes were burning with something that money couldn't buy. Conviction. "Leave her alone," Dalton said. His voice was surprisingly steady as he stepped between Scarlett and the 2 much larger boys. For a moment, there was dead silence. And then Carson burst into a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Are you kidding me? Is this a joke?" He looked at Trent, then at Jessica, then back to Dalton. "Who the hell is this homeless rat?" Trent was already moving forward, towering over Dalton. "Listen to me, garbage," he spat, pointing a thick finger at Dalton's chest. "Walk away right now or I'm going to break your jaw." From behind him, Dalton heard Scarlett's frantic whisper. "Don't. They'll kill you. Just go." Dalton didn't move, didn't look back at her. His eyes were locked on Trent. "I'm not leaving," Dalton said quietly. There was a fractional moment, a heartbeat where the world held its breath, where Dalton's survival instinct screamed at him to run, where the smarter part of his brain calculated odds and outcomes and concluded that this was suicide. But there was another part of Dalton, the part that had been beaten down and made invisible for so long. The part that remembered being 12 years old and useless. That part had been dormant for 2 years, and now it was wide awake. Trent threw the first punch. It was a heavy looping right hook, the kind of punch from someone who'd never been taught proper technique, but didn't need it because he had 80 pounds of muscle behind it. Dalton saw it coming. 14 months in a Fresno juvenile detention center had taught him a few things. How to take a punch, how to slip a punch, how to survive when you were the smallest guy in the yard. Dalton ducked. The fist whistled past his ear close enough that he felt the wind of it. And then Dalton did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He swung back. It wasn't a trained punch. It wasn't a perfect punch. But it was a punch thrown with every ounce of rage and fear and desperation in Dalton's thin frame, and it connected squarely with Trent's nose. There was a satisfying, sickening crunch, cartilage and bone and shock. Trent stumbled back, hands flying to his face. Blood instantly spurted between his fingers, bright red against his pale skin. For a split second, there was dead absolute silence in that alley. Trent touched his nose, looked at the blood on his fingers, and his eyes went wide with pure homicidal rage. "You're dead!" Trent roared. He didn't throw another punch. He didn't give Dalton a chance to fight. He tackled Dalton like a linebacker hitting a quarterback, driving his shoulder into Dalton's chest, slamming him back into the brick wall with a force that knocked every molecule of air out of Dalton's lungs. Dalton's vision exploded into white stars. His back screamed in protest, and then Trent had him by the shirt, throwing him to the ground. What happened next wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Trent's boot caught Dalton in the ribs. Once, twice, 3 times. Dalton heard something crack inside his chest. A white-hot, searing pain shot through his torso like lightning. He curled into a fetal position, arms wrapped around his head, trying desperately to protect his skull and vital organs, trying to survive. Get him up. Carson's voice shrill now, the veneer of calm completely shattered by the sight of blood. Hands grabbed Dalton's ragged shirt, hauling him to his knees. Dalton's vision was blurry, his head spinning. He saw Carson's fist coming, but couldn't move fast enough to dodge. The punch caught him square in the face. His nose shattered, his mouth filled with the copper taste of blood. His vision exploded again into white and red. Stop, stop it. Scarlett's scream cut through the fog. Dalton felt her try to grab Carson, her fingernails raking at his face. But Carson shoved her roughly. She hit the asphalt again hard. Stay down, bitch, Carson yelled. Another kick caught Dalton in the stomach. He dry heaved his body trying to vomit, but there was nothing in his stomach to bring up. Just pain, just agony, just the feeling of his consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. But even as the darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, even as the pain became an ocean trying to drown him, Dalton kept his eyes open, focused, counting 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 120 seconds. He saw Scarlett scrambling toward her dropped leather jacket, not toward her phone, not toward her backpack, toward the jacket. She reached into the lining with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Dalton's mangled body. She pulled out a small black device, not quite a phone, not quite a radio, something in between, and she pressed a button on it. Hard, desperate. 150 seconds. Carson saw the device. For the first time, real panic cracked through his arrogance. Trent, let's go. Leave the trash, we're out of here. Trent delivered one final vicious kick to Dalton's side. The pain was so intense that Dalton's vision went completely white. He heard the sound of running footsteps, the screech of tires, rubber burning against asphalt as the white Silverado reversed wildly out of the alley and sped away. 180 seconds. Dalton had done it. 3 minutes. He'd bought her the time she needed. The alley fell silent except for the sound of Dalton's ragged, bubbling breaths. He could taste blood, feel it pooling under his face on the hot asphalt. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. Scarlett crawled over to him. Her hands were covered in his blood as she gently touched his face. Hey, look at me. She sobbed, her tough exterior completely shattered. Why did you do that? Why did you do that for me? Dalton tried to speak, tried to tell her it was okay, that he'd made the choice, that for the first time in 2 years he'd chosen to be visible, to matter. But all that came out was a wet, choking cough. His eyes started to roll back. The darkness wasn't creeping anymore. It was rushing in like a tidal wave. But before it took him completely, Dalton heard something that didn't make sense. Not the wail of police sirens, not the screech of an ambulance. Something else. A low, distant rumble, a vibration that seemed to shake the very foundation of the alley. A sound like thunder rolling across asphalt. The deep, synchronized roar of multiple engines. Not cars, not trucks, motorcycles. A lot of them. And then the darkness swallowed Dalton whole. The first thing Dalton registered when consciousness crawled back wasn't sight, it was smell. And it wasn't the smell he expected. If he'd been thinking clearly, he would have expected the sterile chemical stench of a county hospital. Antiseptic and bleach and that particular smell of institutional despair. But this wasn't that. This smelled of rich tobacco smoke hanging in stale air. Worn leather that had absorbed years of sweat and road dust, motor oil and gasoline. And underneath it all, the sharp tang of medical antiseptic, but not hospital antiseptic. Something cleaner, more expensive. Dalton tried to open his eyes, but his right eye wouldn't respond. It was swollen completely shut, the eyelid puffy and tight. Through the narrow slit of his left eye, the world was a blurry, dim haze of shapes and shadows. He realized he was lying on something surprisingly comfortable. Not a hospital bed, something softer. Leather, maybe a couch. He tried to sit up. Don't even think about it, kid. The voice was like gravel being crushed under a boot heel, deep, resonant, and entirely lacking in warmth. It carried the kind of authority that didn't ask for obedience. It commanded it. A massive hand pressed gently but firmly against Dalton's uninjured shoulder, pinning him back down against the leather. The hand alone was the size of Dalton's entire shoulder. Scarred knuckles, tattoos creeping down from the wrist. You've got 3 broken ribs, a severe concussion, a fractured orbital bone, and internal bruising that looks like you got hit by a freight train. The voice continued. So unless you want to puncture a lung, you're going to lie still and let Dr. Crane finish his work. Dalton blinked, his vision slowly clearing. The man standing over him was a giant, at least 6'4", built like a brick wall that had been covered in muscle and wrapped in black leather. He had a thick gray and black beard cropped short and meticulously maintained. His arms were completely covered in intricate faded tattoos. Military ink mixed with road ink mixed with things Dalton couldn't quite make out. The man wore a heavy black leather vest. On the front breast, Dalton could make out a rocker patch. White letters on black leather. President on top. Bakersfield on the bottom. This was Axel Maddox, Scarlett's father. Dalton's heart rate spiked. The monitor he was hooked up to started beeping faster. Easy, Axel said, not unkindly. You're safe. Safe was a relative term. Dalton let his one working eye scan the room as much as he could without moving his head. It was massive, like a converted warehouse or garage. Exposed brick walls, concrete floors that had been polished to a dull sheen. There was a long wooden bar in the background, the kind you'd see in an old Western saloon. A pool table, several motorcycles parked in neat rows, their chrome gleaming under industrial overhead lights. Men in similar leather vests moved around the space with purpose. Some were cleaning weapons, some were working on bikes, some were just watching Dalton with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility to grudging respect. This wasn't a hospital. This was a Hell's Angels clubhouse. Where am I? Dalton's voice came out as a croak. His throat felt like he'd swallowed sandpaper. Axel pulled up a heavy wooden chair and sat down beside the couch. The chair groaned under his weight. He leaned forward, resting his massive elbows on his knees, and locked eyes with Dalton. You're in my house, Axel said. My name is Axel Maddox. That girl you took a beating for is my daughter Scarlett. Dalton swallowed hard, wincing at the pain in his jaw. She okay? Something shifted in Axel's hard eyes. A fractional softening that spoke volumes about the man's relationship with his daughter. She's fine. Bruised knees, scraped palms, bruised ego. Thanks to you. Axel leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his massive chest. I've got a private doctor who handles our occupational hazards. Dr. Crane patched you up. Said if you'd taken one more kick to the spleen, you'd be in a morgue right now instead of on my couch. Dalton looked down at his bare chest. He was shirtless, his ribs tightly bound in thick white bandages that wrapped around his entire torso. An IV needle was taped securely into his left arm, feeding him clear fluids from a bag hanging on a makeshift stand. Why am I here? Dalton asked. Why not a hospital? Axel's expression didn't change. Hospitals ask questions. Questions lead to police reports. Police reports lead to investigations. And investigations lead to paperwork. I don't like paperwork when it comes to people putting their hands on my family. The implication hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. Axel wasn't just keeping Dalton out of the system. He was keeping Trent and Carson out of the system too, because Axel wanted to handle them his way. Off the grid, no badges, no rules, just consequences. They're just kids. Dalton whispered the words coming out before he could stop them. Stupid rich kids. Axel let out a short, humorless laugh. Kid out here, there's no such thing as just kids. There are predators and there is prey. Those boys decided to play predator with the wrong bloodline. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled something out. Dalton's battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. The pages were more worn than ever, some of them stained with what looked like blood. Dalton's blood, probably. Axel tossed it gently onto the couch next to Dalton. Scarlett told me everything. Said some homeless ghost stepped out of the shadows and threw himself to the wolves so she could hit the panic button. Axel leaned closer, and the smell of danger rolling off him was suffocating. Tobacco and leather and violence kept on a tight leash. I had my boys do some digging while you were unconscious. Dalton Reed, 16 years old. No family on record. No permanent address. Ran away from a group home in Fresno 2 years ago. You've been living in a rusted-out Ford Bronco behind the train yard. Dalton felt a flush of shame mixed with the physical pain. His entire pathetic existence summed up in 3 sentences. You literally have nothing, Axel continued. You are nobody. The words stung worse than the broken ribs. But, Axel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble, you threw your life away from my daughter, a girl you don't even know. Dalton looked away, staring at the exposed rafters overhead. I just couldn't watch it happen. Not again. There was a long, heavy silence. The background noise of the clubhouse seemed to fade. The other men in the room had gone quiet, watching, waiting for their president's verdict. In my world, Axel finally said, his voice low and absolute, a debt of blood is the only currency that matters. You bled for my blood. That means I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Dalton protested weakly. Just let me heal up and I'll go back to the yards. Axel stood up, towering. The look in his eyes was final. The yards are gone, kid. I had my boys tow that piece of junk Bronco to the scrap heap 3 hours ago. Panic flared in Dalton's chest, sharp enough to cut through the pain medication. What? Why, that was my home. That was a metal coffin, Axel corrected coldly. You don't sleep in the dirt anymore. You saved a Hell's Angel's daughter. Do you think I'm going to let the guy who saved my little girl sleep in the mud like a dog? The club would lose every ounce of respect we have if I let that stand. Axel reached out and tapped the leather of his vest right over his heart where the club patch sat. You're under my roof now. You heal up here. You eat at my table. And when you're back on your feet, we're going to have a long talk about your future. Before Dalton could protest, before he could process what was happening, the heavy metal door at the far end of the clubhouse slammed open with a bang that echoed off the brick walls. 2 massive bikers walked in. Between them, struggling and bleeding and weeping hysterically, was Trent Garrison. His expensive football jersey was torn and stained with blood. His face was swollen and bruised. All the tough guy's swagger was gone, replaced by raw animal terror. The terror of a boy who had just realized that monsters were real, and they knew his name. Axel didn't even look back at the door. He kept his eyes locked on Dalton, studying the boy's reaction. Rest up, Dalton, Axel said softly. But there was nothing soft about the predatory smile spreading across his bearded face. Dr. Crane will be back to check on you in a few hours. I've got some business to attend to. We're going to teach the rich boys of Bakersfield a lesson about consequences. Axel turned and walked toward the back of the clubhouse, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete floor. His men parted for him like the Red Sea. Trent was dragged screaming and begging toward a heavy soundproof door at the back of the building. The door opened. Dalton caught a glimpse of what looked like a workshop. Tools on the walls, a single chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room, and then the door closed. Trent's screams began before the door even fully shut. Dalton lay there on the leather couch staring at the ceiling, his broken body wrapped in bandages, and his mind wrapped in horror. By saving a girl from the fire, he had just been pulled straight into hell. And the terrifying part was that he wasn't sure if he wanted to leave. The first week after the alleyway was a blur of pain and medication. Dalton drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to heal from damage that should have killed him. Dr. Crane, a gray-haired man with steady hands and a face that had seen too much, came by twice a day to check his vitals, adjust his bandages, and push more painkillers into his IV. But by November 1st, the fog started to lift, and Dalton began to truly see the world he'd stumbled into. The Hells Angels clubhouse operated like a well-oiled machine. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't random violence. It was organized, hierarchical, and efficient. Men had roles. Gunner ran the garage where they customized bikes and did legitimate mechanic work. Reaper handled security and enforcement. Hawk was intelligence, the quiet one in the corner, who always seemed to be on a phone or laptop. And Axel Maddox sat at the center of it all like a general commanding an army. They called themselves the Bakersfield chapter, 23 full patch members, another dozen prospects trying to earn their way in, and a network of associates, old ladies and hangers-on that extended throughout Kern County like an underground railroad. On November 3rd, Dr. Crane finally cleared Dalton to get up and move around. The ribs were still tender, the orbital bone still healing, but Dalton was young, and his body was desperate to rebuild itself after 2 years of malnutrition in survival mode. Axel found him that afternoon, standing in the main garage area, watching Gunner tear down a 1985 Harley shovelhead engine. "You want to eat my food, you work," Axel said without preamble. He tossed Dalton a pair of heavy grease-stained coveralls. "Go see Gunner. Tell him you're the new shop rat." Dalton caught the coveralls, wincing as the movement pulled at his ribs. "I don't know anything about motorcycles." "Then you'll learn," Axel said. It wasn't a suggestion. Gunner was a bear of a man, easily 300 pounds, most of it muscle, buried under a layer of working man bulk. He had a wild red beard streaked with gray arms the size of tree trunks and a surprisingly gentle demeanor when he wasn't breaking bones for the club. "Your ghost," Gunner asked, not looking up from the engine block he was inspecting. Dalton corrected. "Nah," Gunner said, finally looking at him. "You're ghost now. That's what Axel calls you. That's what the club calls you. Might as well get used to it." The name stung at first, a reminder of what he'd been, invisible, forgotten. But as the days passed, Dalton began to understand that the club didn't use it as an insult. They used it with a kind of rough respect, the ghost who stepped out of the shadows, the phantom who couldn't be ignored. Dalton's job for the first week was simple: sweep the concrete floors, organize tools, clean parts in solvent baths, fetch coffee, the grunt work that every new guy had to do to prove they weren't above getting their hands dirty. But Dalton didn't just work. He watched, he observed, he learned. When you've spent 2 years invisible on the streets, you develop a particular skill set. You learn to read people, to anticipate patterns, to see the small details that everyone else misses. And Dalton brought all of those skills to the garage. He noticed that Gunner always organized his socket wrenches from smallest to largest, left to right. So Dalton started organizing them that way before Gunner even asked. He noticed that the shop tended to run low on brake fluid every Thursday, so he made sure it was restocked on Wednesday. He noticed which bikes belonged to which members, what their maintenance schedules were, what parts they preferred. By November 5th, Gunner had stopped treating him like a shop rat and started actually teaching him how to gap spark plugs, how to adjust carburetor mixtures, how to bleed brake lines, how to read the sound of an engine and know exactly what was wrong. Dalton absorbed it all like a sponge. He had a mind that remembered everything. Photographic memory, the counselors at the group home had called it. A gift that had done him absolutely no good on the streets, but suddenly became invaluable in the garage. Scarlett visited him every day. At first, the visits were awkward. She'd bring him plates of hot food, steak and mashed potatoes and thick stews prepared by the club's old ladies, the women who'd married into this life or grown up in it. She'd set the food down and sit in the corner, staring at her hands, not quite knowing what to say. Dalton didn't push. He ate with the ravenous hunger of someone whose body was desperately trying to rebuild itself. And he waited. It was on November 6th, a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after the alleyway, that Scarlett finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to do it," she said quietly, watching him eat. "I had the panic button. The club would have been there in 3 minutes." Dalton wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. 3 minutes is a long time when you're on the ground. You didn't know about the button, Scarlett countered. No, Dalton admitted. I didn't. Then why? Scarlett looked up, her dark eyes piercing him. Everyone else at that school just walks past me. They pretend I don't exist because they're terrified of my dad. Why did you step in? Dalton paused, setting down his fork. He looked at his bandaged hands. The bruises were fading to yellow and green, the cuts healing into pink scars. Because when you're invisible, you see everything, he said slowly. I saw how Carson looked at you. It wasn't about liking you. It was about owning you, about control. He paused. I had a foster sister once. Somebody tried to own her too. I was too small to stop it back then. I guess I decided I wasn't going to be too small this time. Something in Scarlett's expression cracked. The tough exterior, the defensive wall she'd built, living as a Hell's Angels daughter. She stood up and walked over, sitting on the edge of his bed. She didn't say anything, but she reached out and rested her hand over his. In that silent gesture, something formed between them. Not romance. Something deeper. Recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to be invisible in different ways, finding each other in the chaos. But Dalton's recovery wasn't the only thing happening in the clubhouse. There was a tension building, an electric feeling in the air, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. On November 7th, Axel called a church meeting. That was what they called it when the full patch members gathered in the private room at the back of the clubhouse to discuss club business. Prospects weren't allowed. Outsiders definitely weren't allowed. But Dalton had been cleaning in the hallway outside when the meeting started. And when you're invisible, people forget you're there. They forget that ears can hear through doors. Axel's voice muffled but clear. Trent Garrison is in the hospital. Permanent nerve damage to his right hand. His football scholarship is gone. His family is terrified. They're not talking. Another voice, Reaper probably. And the other one, Carson Whitmore. Missing, Axel said. There was dark satisfaction in his tone. Hasn't been seen at school in a week. Word is his father Preston has him locked down in their mansion. The boy's scared out of his mind. Good, someone else said. Let them be scared. But then Axel's voice changed, became harder. Preston Whitmore isn't going to take this lying down. He's one of the richest men in Bakersfield. He owns half the commercial real estate in this county. The fact that we put his son in hiding and destroyed his attack dog is going to eat at him. Men like Preston don't forgive. They retaliate. Let him try, someone said. We've dealt with bigger threats than some real estate developer. Don't underestimate him, Axel warned. Rich men don't fight with fists. They fight with money. And money can buy things we can't. The meeting continued, but Dalton had heard enough. He slipped away, his mind already turning, already calculating. That night, Dalton lay in his new room, a small space off the main clubhouse that had been converted for him, and thought about what came next. He wasn't going to waste this second chance at life being passive, being saved. He was going to become something more. On November 8th, everything changed. Axel found Dalton in the garage watching Gunnar rebuild a transmission. Ghost, church room, now. Dalton followed Axel into the private meeting room. It was the first time he'd been invited inside. The walls were covered in club memorabilia, patches from other chapters, photos of members past and present. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, carved with initials and burn marks from years of use. The full patch members were there, 23 hard men in leather, all watching Dalton with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Axel gestured to an empty chair. Sit. Dalton sat. Axel remained standing, pacing at the head of the table. Preston Whitmore owns a custom bike shop on the east side. Competition to our legitimate business. They've been undercutting our prices, poaching our customers, spreading rumors that our work is substandard. We've known this for months, Reaper said. What's changed? What's changed, Axel said, is that I'm tired of playing defense. It's time to send Preston a message. Show him that protecting his son has consequences. He looked directly at Dalton. Ghost here is going to help us plan our first strike. The room went silent. 23 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the 16-year-old kid in the two big coveralls. With all due respect, Prez, one of the older members, said, the kid's been here a week. He doesn't know how we operate. He knows something more valuable, Axel said. He knows how to be invisible in this city. He survived 2 years on these streets. He knows back alleys, access points, blind spots that we don't. And I've been watching him in the garage. The kid's got a brain. Axel turned to Dalton. You talk about wanting to earn your keep. Prove it. Plan the hit on Whitmore's bike shop. Dalton's heart hammered in his chest. This was a test. Pass, and he'd earn real respect. Fail, and he'd be just another charity case taking up space. He thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. Then he stood up and walked to a map of Bakersfield pinned to the wall. Whitmore's shop is here, Dalton said, pointing to a location on 4th Street. Main entrance faces the street, security cameras cover the front. Alarm system wired to private security, not police. 2 exits, front door and rear loading dock. How do you know all this? Someone asked. I used to sleep in the alley behind that building, Dalton said simply. 6 months ago, before I found the Bronco, I know the owner comes in at 6 a.m. I know the night cleaning crew leaves at midnight. I know there's a 45-minute window where the building is empty. He traced a route on the map. We don't go through the front. We come through the storm drain system. There's an access point 3 blocks away. The tunnels run under 4th Street. There's a grate in the alley behind the shop that's been broken for months. Nobody's fixed it because nobody thinks about storm drains. The room was silent now, listening. We go in at 1 a.m., Dalton continued. Small team, 3 people max. We bypass the rear door using a crowbar on the loading dock hinges. Once inside, we hit the insurance pressure points, spark the electrical panel to make it look like faulty wiring, set a slow chemical fire using paint thinner and accelerants from their own supply closet. By the time it's detected, we're back in the tunnels and gone. The kid's describing arson, someone muttered. I'm describing an accident, Dalton corrected. Faulty wiring is common in older buildings. Insurance will pay out. Whitmore loses his investment, his competition edge, and his reputation. And there's no evidence pointing back here. Axel was smiling, that predatory, dangerous smile. Who leads the team? Every survival instinct in Dalton's body screamed at him to stay quiet, to let someone else take the risk. But he'd spent 2 years being invisible, being safe, being nothing. I do, Dalton said. I know the route, I know the building, I lead. Gunner let out a low whistle. Reaper actually laughed. Kid's got balls. Axel studied Dalton for a long moment. You're still healing. 3 broken ribs? They're broken whether I use them or not, Dalton said. I can move, I can think, I can lead. Axel nodded slowly. Gunner Reaper, you go with him. Ghost plans it. Ghost leads it. You two make sure he doesn't get killed. The vote was unanimous. 3 nights later, at exactly 1 a.m. on November 11th, Dalton Reed led his first operation. The storm drain access point was exactly where Dalton remembered it. A heavy concrete slab in an empty lot between 2 abandoned buildings. Gunner lifted it like it weighed nothing, revealing a black void that smelled of stagnant water and urban decay. Dalton went first, lowering himself into the darkness with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. His ribs screamed in protest, but he ignored them. Pain was temporary. Respect was everything. The tunnel was 4 feet in diameter, concrete and rust in the accumulated filth of decades. Water trickled along the bottom, never quite deep enough to be dangerous, but enough to soak through their boots. Dalton moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who'd slept in worse places. Behind him, Gunner and Reaper followed their larger frames, struggling with the tight space. But they didn't complain. They'd been told to follow the ghost lead, and that's what they were doing. Dalton counted his steps. 37 paces to the first junction. Turn left, 52 paces to the second junction, Turn right, 18 paces to the broken grate. The grate was exactly as he remembered. Rusted one corner completely separated from its frame, just wide enough for a human body to squeeze through. They emerged in the alley behind Whitmore's custom cycles. The building loomed above them, dark and silent. No lights, no movement, just the hum of the electrical panel and the distant sound of late-night traffic. Dalton moved to the loading dock. The hinges were external, just like he'd remembered. Gunner produced a crowbar and went to work. 3 minutes later, the door swung open silently. Inside, the shop smelled of motor oil paint and money. Rows of custom motorcycles in various states of completion. Expensive parts lined the shelves. This wasn't just a business. This was Preston Whitmore's pride. Dalton moved with surgical precision. He'd memorized the plan down to the second. Reaper went to the electrical panel and used a screwdriver to create a short circuit, sparking wires in a way that would look like natural deterioration. Gunner gathered paint thinner and acetone from the supply closet, positioning the accelerants near the electrical panel where the spark would eventually reach them. Dalton set the timing mechanism, a simple battery-operated igniter wired to a cheap kitchen timer purchased with cash at a hardware store 30 miles away. Untraceable. The fire would start 90 minutes after they left, long enough for them to be far away, soon enough that the building would be empty. 18 minutes after entering, they were back in the storm drains. 23 minutes after entering, they were emerging 3 blocks away. The grate replaced no evidence they'd ever been there. At 3:47 a.m., Dalton was back in the clubhouse, showering off the stench of the tunnels. At 4:30 a.m., he was in his bed waiting for dawn. The fire was reported at 2:32 a.m. By the time the fire department arrived, the building was fully engulfed. Damage estimate $400,000. Insurance investigation concluded faulty wiring in an aging electrical system. Preston Whitmore's competition was destroyed, and nobody could prove the Hells Angels had anything to do with it. When Dalton walked into the clubhouse common room that afternoon, the patch members gave him nods of respect. Gunner clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to make him wince. Reaper actually smiled, and Axel pulled him aside. "You earned your keep, Ghost. You've got a place here as long as you want it." But the victory was short-lived, because Preston Whitmore was exactly the kind of man Axel had warned about. And rich men didn't fight fair. On November 12th, 4 days after the bike shop burned, the war truly began. The first strike came at dawn. 3 club prospects were riding Highway 99 making a routine supply run. They never saw the shooter. Just the sudden, explosive sound of high-powered rifle fire from an overpass. Tires shredded, bikes went down at 70 miles per hour, metal and flesh grinding against asphalt. All 3 survived, but barely. Broken bones, road rash, concussions. They were pulled from the wreckage and medevac to Bakersfield Memorial. The second strike came 2 days later, a drive-by shooting at the clubhouse. Not gangbangers in a lowrider. Professional. A black SUV with tinted windows, automatic rifle fire that stitched across the front of the building, shattering windows, punching holes in brick. No one was killed, but 2 members were wounded, and the message was clear. Preston Whitmore had declared war. The clubhouse went into immediate lockdown. Steel shutters were rolled down over the windows. Armed guards were posted on the roof 24/7. Assault rifles were pulled from hidden caches. The Angels prepared for a siege. In the church room, Axel's face was carved from granite. "This isn't the Mayans," he growled to his officers. "This isn't the Mongols. This is too clean, too tactical. Someone hired professionals." "Whitmore," Reaper said. "It wasn't a question." "Has to be," Axel agreed. "But we can't prove it, and we can't hit back if we don't know where to aim." That was when Dalton spoke up. He'd been sitting in the corner listening, learning. But now he'd seen something the others had missed. "I know where to aim," Dalton said quietly. All eyes turned to him. "There's been a black Escalade parked 3 blocks down from the club house for the past 2 days," Dalton continued. "Same vehicle, same parking spot, tinted windows, no plates, just sitting there." Axel frowned. How do you know it's the same vehicle? Because I've been watching it, Dalton said. When you're invisible, you notice things. That SUV has been running surveillance, professional surveillance. The driver sits perfectly still for hours, never moves, never gets out, just watches. Why didn't you tell us this yesterday? Axel demanded. Because I needed to be sure, Dalton said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Last night I snuck out the back way, crawled under parked cars down the street just like I used to do when I was hiding from cops at the train yard. Got close enough to plant this. He unfolded the paper to reveal a confirmation number for a GPS tracking device. $40 at a truck stop. Anonymous purchase. I put a tracker under the wheel well, Dalton said, and I've been following its movements on my phone. The room went dead silent. You what? Axel's voice was dangerously quiet. I tracked it, Dalton repeated. The SUV leaves here at shift change, goes to the Grand Lux Hotel downtown, parks in the private garage, stays there for 8 hours, then comes back, rinse and repeat. Dalton pulled out a cheap smartphone, one of the disposable ones you could buy at convenience stores. He opened a tracking app and showed them the screen. A red dot pulsing on a map, the Grand Lux Hotel. The penthouse suite, Dalton said. And guess who owns the Grand Lux? Preston Whitmore, Reaper breathed. Dalton nodded. He hired mercenaries, private military contractors. They're not local. They're not bikers. They're soldiers. And they're operating out of Whitmore's hotel. Axel stared at Dalton with an expression that was equal parts shock and respect. You did all this on your own, without telling anyone. I learned a long time ago that if you want to survive, you gather intelligence first, Dalton said. I wasn't going to bring you half-assed information. I needed to be sure. Gunner let out a low whistle. Ghost just saved us weeks of investigation. But Axel was still staring at Dalton. You took a hell of a risk. I took a calculated risk, Dalton corrected. I'm good at being invisible. They never saw me. For a long moment, Axel didn't speak. Then slowly, deliberately, he smiled. You're not just a survivor, Ghost. You're tactical. You think like a soldier. He turned to address the room. Preston Whitmore wants a war. He thinks he can hire Ghost to do his dirty work. But we've got our own Ghost, and he just found their base of operations. Axel looked at Dalton. Can you get us inside that hotel? I can do better than that, Dalton said. I can draw them out. The plan came together over the next 48 hours, and it was Dalton's plan from start to finish. The mercenaries were watching the clubhouse, waiting for the angels to make a move. They expected retaliation. They expected violence. They were prepared for a frontal assault. They weren't prepared for bait. On November 20th, at exactly 9 p.m., Dalton Reed walked out of the clubhouse alone. No escort, no protection. Just a 16-year-old kid in a jacket walking through the industrial district like he didn't have a care in the world. The black Escalade followed within minutes. Dalton led them on a meandering route through streets he knew intimately, past the old factory buildings, through the maze of storage facilities, into the heart of the industrial zone where Dalton had slept rough for 6 months before finding the Bronco. This was his territory, his hunting ground. The Escalade kept its distance, professional and patient. 3 blocks back, never too close, never too far. But Dalton could feel their eyes on him, tracking, calculating. He led them deeper, into a section of the industrial zone that had been abandoned for decades. Rusted warehouses, collapsed fences, no streetlights, no cameras, no witnesses. The perfect killing ground. Dalton ducked into a narrow alley between 2 warehouse buildings. The kind of alley where homeless kids went to hide. The kind of alley where bodies were found. The Escalade stopped at the mouth of the alley. Engine idling, 4 men climbed out. Tactical gear, suppressed weapons. Professional killers who thought they were hunting a scared street kid. They moved into the alley in a wedge formation. Textbook, military. Dalton was nowhere to be seen. But the Hells Angels were everywhere. They'd been in position for an hour. On the roofs, behind the dumpsters, in the warehouse windows, 20 armed bikers with a clear line of sight and orders to eliminate the threat. The first mercenary took a shotgun blast to the chest that dropped him like a puppet with cut strings. The second spun toward the threat and caught 3 rounds from Reaper's AR-15. The third tried to run and was clotheslined by Gunner 300 pounds of fury that slammed the man into the concrete hard enough to crack bone. The fourth, the team leader managed to get his weapon up, managed to fire. Bullets sparked off brick and metal, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Hawk put 2 rounds center mass and the man dropped. It was over in 18 seconds. Dalton emerged from behind a dumpster, his heart hammering, but his hand steady. He'd been invisible again. The bait that drew predators into the trap. Axel walked over his rifle, still raised, sweeping for additional threats. "You good ghost." "I'm good," Dalton said. 3 mercenaries were dead. One was still breathing barely. The team leader, Gunner, hauled him up by his tactical vest and slammed him against the warehouse wall. "Who hired you?" Axel demanded, pressing his pistol under the man's chin. The mercenary, his name tag read, Devereaux, coughed blood. "Go to hell." "You first," Axel said. But Dalton stepped forward. "Let me," Dalton said quietly. Axel stepped back, curious. Dalton leaned in close to Devereaux. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "I spent 14 months in juvie in Fresno. I learned a lot there. Learned how to serve. Learned how to read people. Learned how to hurt people in ways that don't leave marks." He pulled out a cheap smartphone and showed Devereaux a photo, a screenshot from a Facebook page, Devereaux's wife and 2 young kids. "Your family lives in Calabasas," Dalton said softly. "Pretty house, nice neighborhood. Your daughter takes dance classes on Tuesday and Thursday. Your son plays Little League on Saturdays." Devereaux's eyes went wide with terror. "I'm not threatening them," Dalton continued. "I'm just showing you that I can find anyone. I've been invisible in this city for 2 years. I know how to disappear, and I know how to make other people disappear." He leaned closer. "So I'm going to ask you one time. Who hired you?" "Preston Whitmore," Devereaux choked out. $2 million. He wanted the club destroyed, wanted it to look like a gang war. "Where's he keeping his records?" Dalton asked. "I don't know," Devereaux gasped. "I swear, we reported to him at the hotel penthouse, but I never saw his files." Dalton stood up, looked at Axel. "He's telling the truth." Axel nodded, raised his weapon. Devereaux closed his eyes. "Wait," Dalton said. "Let him go." The entire alley went silent. 20 bikers stared at Dalton like he'd lost his mind. "Let him go," Dalton repeated, "with a message for Preston Whitmore. Tell him we're coming. Tell him we know everything. Tell him that if he runs, we'll find him. If he hides, we'll dig him out. And tell him that a ghost is coming for him." Axel studied Dalton for a long moment. Then slowly he lowered his weapon. "Cut him loose." Devereaux stumbled away, bleeding and broken, carrying Dalton's message. Behind him, the Angels loaded the bodies into a van. They'd be buried deep in the Mojave Desert by dawn. Back at the clubhouse, Axel pulled Dalton aside. "Why'd you let him walk?" "Because Preston needs to know we're coming," Dalton said. "Fear is a weapon. I want him terrified. I want him making mistakes. And I want him to know that his money can't protect him anymore." Axel looked at the 16-year-old kid who'd gone from homeless to tactician in less than 3 weeks. "You're thinking strategically now, planning moves ahead." Dalton nodded. "The best revenge isn't violence. It's dismantling someone piece by piece until there's nothing left." "So what's your next move, Ghost?" Dalton looked at the map of Bakersfield pinned to the wall, his eyes focused on the Grand Lux Hotel. "I'm going to infiltrate Whitmore's penthouse, alone. I'm going to find his records, his ledgers, everything he's trying to hide. and I'm going to destroy him with his own secrets. That's suicide, Axel said flatly. The hotel has security, cameras, armed guards. You can't just walk in. I'm not going to walk in, Dalton said. I'm going to be invisible. One more time. Over the next 3 days, Dalton prepared. He studied the Grand Lux Hotel from every angle. 7 months ago, before he found the Bronco, he'd slept on the steam grates on the south side of that building to stay warm during the cold nights. He knew the service entrances, knew the overnight kitchen staff propped open the back door with a cinder block so they could smoke without triggering alarms. Knew the freight elevators used for moving banquet equipment went straight to the roof access right above the penthouse. He watched the shift changes, memorized the patterns, calculated the windows of opportunity. On November 24th, Dalton presented his plan to Axel, a full infiltration, solo operation, steal Whitmore's financial records and escape before anyone knew he was there. I forbid it, Axel said. It's too dangerous. We'll wait for another opportunity. But Dalton had made up his mind. That night at 2 a.m. on November 25th, he slipped out of the clubhouse through a basement window. He left a note for Axel. Simple, direct. I'm not asking permission anymore. I'm finishing this. Trust me. Ghost. And then Dalton Reed, the invisible boy who'd become a phantom, walked alone into the heart of enemy territory to face the most dangerous gamble of his young life. The Grand Lux Hotel stood in the heart of downtown Bakersfield like a monument to everything Dalton Reed had never been allowed to touch. 24 floors of glass and steel and money gleaming under the sodium streetlights. The kind of building that had security guards who'd chase homeless kids away from the entrance. The kind of building where people like Dalton were invisible by design. But tonight, being invisible was exactly what Dalton needed. He approached from the south side, moving through the shadows with the practiced ease of someone who'd survived 2 years by never being seen. The alley behind the Grand Lux smelled familiar. Rotting garbage from the hotel kitchen, stale grease from the ventilation, and underneath it all, the faint metallic tang of the steam grates where he'd slept 7 months ago before he found the Bronco. The service door was exactly where he remembered. Heavy steel marked employees only. And just like 7 months ago, the overnight kitchen staff had propped it open with a concrete cinder block. They never learned. Minimum wage workers sneaking cigarette breaks, thinking no one would notice a door left ajar in the middle of the night. Dalton slipped through the gap. The corridor beyond was narrow and institutional. Concrete floors, fluorescent lights, the smell of industrial cleaning products. This was the hotel that guests never saw. The machinery that kept luxury running smoothly. He moved quickly but carefully, staying close to the walls, his gray eyes constantly scanning for cameras. There were blind spots in any security system. You just had to know where to look. The freight elevator was at the end of the corridor, exactly where it had always been. A massive cargo lift used for moving furniture, banquet supplies, equipment. No security camera pointing at it because no one imagined a threat would come through the service areas. Rich people never thought about the invisible infrastructure that supported their comfort. Dalton pressed the call button, waited. His heart hammered against his healing ribs, but his hands were steady. He'd made the choice to come here alone, to prove he was more than someone to be protected, to prove he could finish what he started. The elevator arrived with a dull ding that echoed in the empty corridor. Dalton stepped inside. The control panel went all the way to the roof access. Floor 25, one level above the penthouse. He pressed the button and the doors slid shut. The ascent took 74 seconds. Dalton counted every one. An old habit from the streets. Always know how long things take, how long you have to run, how long you have to hide, how long you have to survive. The elevator opened onto the roof access level. Cold night air rushed in through ventilation grates. The mechanical hum of HVAC systems. The distant sound of the city below. Dalton found the maintenance ladder that led to the rooftop. Climbed with his ribs protesting every movement. 3 weeks of healing wasn't enough to erase the damage Trent had done, but pain was just information. a reminder that he was alive. The rooftop was a maze of air conditioning units, satellite dishes, and service equipment. And beyond it all, the glass skylight that looked down into Preston Whitmore's penthouse. Dalton crouched at the edge of the skylight, looking down into luxury he'd never experienced. Leather furniture, marble floors, art on the walls that probably cost more than most people made in a lifetime. The penthouse was massive, occupying the entire top floor. Living room, dining area, multiple bedrooms, branching off hallways he couldn't see. And there in the main living room, pacing back and forth with a crystal glass of scotch in his hand, was Preston Whitmore himself, 52 years old. Silver hair styled with expensive product. Custom suit even at 2:30 in the morning. The kind of man who treated the world like a business transaction. But he wasn't alone. Sitting on one of the white leather couches, hunched over and miserable, was Carson Whitmore, the golden boy who'd ruled North High School like a king, the arrogant teenager who'd ordered Trent to hurt Scarlett, who'd laughed while Dalton was beaten nearly to death. Carson didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a scared kid who'd been locked in a tower by a father who couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. Dalton studied the layout. The skylight was reinforced glass designed to let light in but keep everything else out. But there was a terrace, a private outdoor space accessible through sliding glass doors from the living room. And terraces needed maintenance access. It took Dalton 8 minutes to find the service ladder that led down to the terrace level. The lock on the access door was commercial grade, but Dalton had learned a few things in juvie about locks. A bent paper clip and patience could open almost anything if you understood the mechanism. 12 minutes later, Dalton was standing on Preston Whitmore's private terrace 50 stories above Bakersfield, with nothing but a sliding glass door between him and his target. The door was locked. Of course it was locked, but Dalton had counted on that. He pulled out a small pry bar stolen from the clubhouse garage, slid it into the door frame, and applied pressure. The lock mechanism was designed to keep people from opening the door from outside, but the frame itself was just aluminum. Expensive aluminum, but aluminum nonetheless. The door popped open with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Dalton froze, waited, listened. No alarm, no shouts, just the muffled sound of Preston's voice from the living room arguing with someone on the phone. Dalton slipped inside. He was in a hallway that branched off the main living area. Dark, quiet. He moved like the ghost they called him, staying low, staying silent. Preston's voice carried from the living room. Angry, desperate. I don't care what it costs. I want that clubhouse burned to the ground. I want Axel Maddox humiliated. Do you understand I don't pay you $2 million to fail? Silence. Someone on the other end of the phone responding. The mercenaries are dead. Preston's voice rose. All of them. How is that possible? More silence. Then hire more. We hire an army if you have to. I will not be intimidated by a pack of criminal bikers. Dalton edged closer. The hallway opened into what looked like a private study. Dark wood furniture, built-in bookshelves, a massive desk with a laptop and scattered papers, and on the wall behind the desk, barely visible in the dim light from the living room, a painting. Expensive art in an expensive frame. But Dalton had learned something in the 7 months he'd slept on steam grates below this building. Late at night when Preston thought no one could see him, he'd stand at the windows of his study, and sometimes very late, he'd open a safe hidden behind that painting. Dalton moved to the painting, lifted it carefully off its mounting, and there it was, a wall safe, digital keypad, 8-digit code. This was where most people would fail. Safes like this were designed to be impenetrable without the combination. But Dalton had an advantage. He'd seen Preston open this safe. 7 months ago, sleeping on a steam grate, looking up at the lit windows above, watching a rich man move through his nightly routine. Dalton had watched Preston's fingers on the keypad, had counted the movements, had memorized the pattern. 8 digits, the birthday of Preston's daughter who died in a car accident 15 years ago. A grief pressed in warlike armor using tragedy as an excuse for his cruelty. Dalton entered the code. The safe clicked. The door swung open. Inside was exactly what he'd hoped for. A thick black leather ledger, bank statements, offshore account records, a treasure trove of financial crimes hidden from the IRS from business partners from the world. Dalton pulled it out, started to flip through the pages. 50 million in offshore accounts, city council bribes documented in neat handwriting, payments to shell companies, and worse, connections to the Sinaloa cartel, money laundering through Preston's real estate empire. This wasn't just evidence of financial crime. This was enough to send Preston to federal prison for the rest of his life. What the hell do you think you're doing? Dalton spun. Carson Whitmore stood in the study doorway, baseball bat gripped in both hands. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wild with fear, and something else, desperation. "Put that down," Carson said, his voice shaking. "Put it down or I'll bash your skull in." Dalton slowly closed the ledger, tucked it under his arm. "No, you won't." "I will," Carson insisted. "I'm not afraid of you, street rat. You got lucky in that alley. Trent went easy on you." "Trent shattered my ribs and broke my face," Dalton said calmly. "That's not going easy. And you're not Trent. You're a scared kid holding a bat you don't know how to use." Carson's grip tightened on the bat. "I'm warning you." "You already warned me," Dalton said. "In that alley. Remember, you and your friend decided I wasn't worth seeing. Just another homeless rat, invisible, disposable." He took a step forward. Carson raised the bat higher but didn't swing. "But I saw you, Carson," Dalton continued. "I saw exactly what you were. A predator who thought money made you untouchable, who thought you could hurt people and walk away because Daddy would fix it." "Shut up," Carson whispered. Dalton took another step. Now he was within range of the bat. One swing and Carson could crack his skull. But Dalton had learned something in that alley 3 weeks ago. He'd learned that most bullies were cowards underneath. They only hurt people who couldn't fight back. "Take your swing," Dalton said quietly. "Do it. Prove you're not just your father's puppet." Carson's hands were shaking. The bat wavered, and then with a choked sob he lowered it. "I didn't want to hurt her," Carson whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted her to notice me, to see me. And then it all went wrong and Trent got carried away and I couldn't stop it." "You could have stopped it," Dalton said. "You chose not to. There's a difference." Carson looked at him with tears streaming down his face. "What do you want money?" "My father has money. Just tell me what you want." "I want you to understand something," Dalton said. "I could kill you right now. I could take this bat and beat you the way Trent beat me. I could make you feel every second of pain I felt in that alley." Carson's breathing was rapid, panicked. "But I'm not going to," Dalton continued, "because I'm not like you. I don't hurt people for fun. I survive. And right now, you're not worth the energy." He moved past Carson toward the doorway. Carson didn't try to stop him. But as Dalton reached the hallway, Preston Whitmore stepped out of the living room, a chrome-plated handgun aimed directly at Dalton's chest. "Give me the ledger," Preston said. His voice was cold, controlled, the voice of a man who'd made hard decisions before. "Give it to me or I put a bullet in your homeless heart and call it self-defense." Dalton stopped. For a moment, every instinct screamed at him to run, to drop the ledger and escape, to survive. But then he thought of what he'd learned. The best revenge wasn't violence. It was superior planning. Dalton smiled. It was a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Shoot me," he said calmly, "and the FBI gets emailed copies of every page in this ledger." Preston's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Dalton pulled out his cheap smartphone with his free hand, showed Preston the screen. An email draft, addressed to the FBI field office in Los Angeles. Attached files, photos of every page of the ledger. "I took pictures while you were on the phone," Dalton said, "and I set up an automated send. If I don't enter a cancellation code in the next 20 minutes, the email goes out. So pull that trigger, Preston. End me and watch your empire burn. Preston's hand wavered. You're just a kid, just some homeless trash. I'm the homeless trash who outsmarted your $2 million mercenaries, Dalton said. I'm the trash who infiltrated your fortress. I'm the trash who just stole your entire life. He took a step forward. So what are you going to do about it? Before Preston could respond, the penthouse terrace doors exploded inward, not from a gentle opening, from a controlled breach. Flashbang grenades rolled across the marble floor. The concussive blast was deafening even though Dalton had covered his ears at the last second. The Hells Angels poured through the shattered doors like a wave of leather and fury. Axel Maddox led the charge assault rifle, raised his face carved from stone. Preston tried to turn his weapon toward the new threat. Reaper fired first. A single shot that hit Preston's hand, the bullet destroying bone and sending the chrome pistol clattering across the floor. Preston screamed, clutching his shattered hand. Within seconds, the penthouse was secured. 8 angels spread throughout the space, weapons trained on every corner. Carson was forced to his knees. Preston was yanked to his feet, blood streaming from his hand. Axel walked over to Dalton, his eyes blazing with anger and something else. Respect. I told you not to come here alone, Axel said. I left you a note, Dalton replied. A note isn't permission. I wasn't asking for permission, Dalton had said calmly. He held up the ledger. I already won. You're just here for cleanup. Axel stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he lowered his weapon. Show me what you found. Dalton handed him the ledger. Axel flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with every revelation. 50 million in offshore accounts, bribes, cartel connections, everything. This is enough to bury him for life, Axel said. I know, Dalton replied. That's why I came. Axel looked at Preston, who was slumped against the wall, cradling his shattered hand, all his arrogance stripped away. Then he looked at Dalton. What do you want to do with him, Ghost? It was the first time Axel had ever asked Dalton to make a call like this. Not suggested, not commanded. Asked. Dalton walked over to Preston, crouched down so they were eye level. Preston's expensive suit was stained with blood. His perfect hair was disheveled. The king of Bakersfield reduced to a broken man on his own marble floor. You tried to kill me with your money, Dalton said quietly. Hired mercenaries, burned businesses, shot at my brothers. All because your son couldn't handle being told no by a girl. Please, Preston whispered. I'll pay anything. Name your price. You still don't get it, Dalton said. This isn't about money. This is about consequences. He stood up, addressing the room. Here are the terms. Non-negotiable. He pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket, a contract he drafted back at the clubhouse just in case he survived this far. You're going to sign over 35% of Whitmore Development Corporation to a shell LLC controlled by the club. You're going to employ angels in your security and maintenance divisions at triple union wage. You're going to donate $2 million to the Bakersfield Homeless Youth Shelter. And Carson is going to a boarding school in Switzerland tonight. He never sets foot in this town again. That's extortion, Preston choked out. That's justice, Dalton corrected. Sign it or the ledger goes to the FBI, along with something else you don't know all about yet. Preston looked up. What else? Dalton pulled out his smartphone again. Press play on a recording. Preston's own voice filled the penthouse. I don't care what it costs. I want that clubhouse burned to the ground. I want Axel Maddox humiliated. The mercenaries are dead, all of them. Then hire more. Hire an army if you have to. Dalton stopped the recording. I've been recording since I walked in here. Every word, every confession, conspiracy to commit murder, hiring assassins, all of it documented. He leaned closer. So you have two choices, Preston. Sign the contract and lose 35% of your empire. Or refuse and lose everything when the FBI arrests you for conspiracy, murder for hire, money laundering, and racketeering. Preston looked at his son sobbing on the floor, looked at the angels surrounding him with weapons, looked at the 16-year-old homeless kid who just dismantled his entire world without firing a single shot. "Give me the contract," Preston whispered. 15 minutes later, the contract was signed, witnessed by Axel Maddox and notarized by a lawyer the Angels kept on retainer. Legally binding, ironclad. Carson was escorted to a waiting car, his passport, and a one-way ticket to Zurich already arranged. He didn't look back at his father, didn't say goodbye, just climbed into the car like a prisoner accepting his exile. Preston sat in his ruined living room, his hand bandaged by one of the angels who had medical training, his empire carved up and distributed to the people he tried to destroy. As the angels prepared to leave, Axel pulled Dalton aside. "You could have killed him. Carson, Preston, both of them. You had every right. Killing them would have been easy," Dalton said. "Making them live with what they've lost is harder. Preston will wake up every day knowing a homeless kid outsmarted him. That's worse than death." Axel studied the teenager in front of him. 3 weeks ago, this kid had been bleeding out in an alley. Now he was dictating terms to billionaires. "You're not just smart, Ghost," Axel said quietly. "You're dangerous. The good kind of dangerous." They left the penthouse the way they'd come, down the service elevator, through the back corridors, invisible to the hotel's wealthy guests who'd never know that empires had fallen while they slept. By the time the sun rose over Bakersfield, Preston Whitmore had already called his lawyers, already begun the process of transferring assets, already sent his son across the Atlantic to a Swiss boarding school where American consequences couldn't reach him. And Dalton Reed was back at the clubhouse, exhausted and aching, but alive. 2 days later, on November 27th, Axel Maddox called a full church meeting. Every patch member, every prospect, every associate who could fit in the clubhouse. The room was packed, the air thick with tobacco smoke and anticipation. Dalton stood near the back, uncertain why he'd been summoned. He wasn't a member, wasn't even a prospect, just the ghost who'd earned his keep. Axel stood at the head of the long wooden table. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. 3 weeks ago, Axel began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "My daughter was cornered in an alley by predators. She should have been hurt, should have been violated, should have been traumatized." The room was dead silent. "But a ghost stepped out of the shadows," Axel continued. "A homeless kid with nothing to his name, no reason to care, no reason to risk his life. And he took a beating that would have killed most grown men, just to buy my daughter 3 minutes." Axel's eyes found Dalton in the crowd. "That kid is Dalton Reed. Most of you know him as Ghost. And over the past 3 weeks, he's proven that he's more than just a survivor. He's a tactician, a strategist. He led the hit on Whitmore's bike shop. He tracked mercenaries we didn't even know were there. He infiltrated a fortress alone and came back with the weapon that destroyed our enemy." Axel reached under the table and pulled out a leather vest. Not just any vest. A cut, perfectly sized, black leather scarred from road miles. And on the back, arched across the shoulders in white stitching, "Property of Bakersfield." On the front, over the left breast, a patch that read simply "Ghost." The room erupted, not in chaos, in a low, rolling thunder of approval, fists pounding on tables, men shouting, the sound of a brotherhood recognizing one of their own. Axel held up the vest. "In my world, blood isn't who gave birth to you. Blood is who bleeds for you, who stands when others run, who fights when others surrender." He walked through the crowd toward Dalton. Every eye in the room followed him. "Dalton Reed, you don't sleep in the dirt anymore. You don't eat from dumpsters. You don't hide in the shadows. You're one of us now. You wear our colors. You ride under our protection. And God help anyone who tries to hurt our Ghost." He held out the vest. "Welcome to the family, brother." Dalton's hands shook as he reached out and took the heavy leather. It smelled of road dust and motor oil and belonging. He slipped it over his shoulders. It fit perfectly. The clubhouse exploded. Men who'd been skeptical 3 weeks ago were now clapping Dalton on the back. Gunner wrapped him in a bear hug that nearly cracked his healing ribs all over again. Reaper clasped his hand in a warrior's grip. Scarlet pushed through the crowd and hugged him tight, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered in his ear. "You became somebody." "I became me," Dalton corrected softly. The celebration went on for hours. Music shook the walls. Beer flowed. The smell of roasting meat filled the air. For the first time in 2 years, Dalton Reed ate until he was full, laughed until his face hurt, belonged. Late that night, when most of the brothers had gone home or passed out, Dalton found himself alone in his room. The small space off the main clubhouse that had been converted for him. But it wasn't small anymore. Wasn't temporary. It was home. He sat on his bed, still wearing the leather cut, and picked up his battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. The pages were more worn than ever, stained with blood and sweat and survival. He opened to the final chapter. Edmond Dantes' last words to the young couple he'd saved. Wait and hope. But Dalton had learned something deeper. You didn't just wait and hope. You acted. You planned. You survived. And when the moment came, you seized it with both hands and refused to let go. There was a knock on his door. Axel stepped in without waiting for an answer. "Can't sleep," Axel asked. "Too much adrenaline," Dalton admitted. Axel sat down in the chair by the window. "I need to tell you something about what happens next." Dalton closed his book. Waited. "You're not going to be muscle," Axel said. "You're not going to be an enforcer. You're too smart for that. Too valuable." He leaned forward. "I want you to be our strategist, our planner, the brain that keeps the brawn from making stupid mistakes." "I'm 16, Dalton said. "I don't even have a high school diploma." "You've got something better," Axel replied. "Street smarts, survival instincts, the ability to see patterns other people miss. That's worth more than any degree." Dalton thought about it, about the life he'd been offered. Not just protection, not just shelter, purpose. "What about school?" he asked. "We'll get you a G.on tutor," Axel said. "You'll study, you'll learn, but you'll do it while working for us. Fair deal." Dalton looked down at his vest, at the ghost patch over his heart. Fair deal. Axel stood to leave, but at the door he paused. "You know what the difference is between you and most people, Dalton?" "What?" "Most people spend their whole lives being invisible. You chose to become visible, on your terms. That takes courage most men never find." After Axel left, Dalton lay back on his bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow the world would wake up to news that Preston Whitmore was under FBI investigation, that his business empire was crumbling, that his son had vanished to Europe. Tomorrow the streets of Bakerfield would whisper about the homeless kid who'd risen from nothing to stand with the angels. Tomorrow Dalton Reed would wake up with a purpose, a family, and a future. But tonight he was just a 16-year-old kid who'd survived hell and come out the other side stronger. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 2 years, he slept without fear, without cold, without hunger. He slept like someone who'd finally found home. 3 months later, spring came to Bakersfield. The brutal heat gave way to warm winds and blooming oleanders. The city moved on as cities do, forgetting tragedies and scandals in favor of new dramas. Preston Whitmore was indicted on 17 counts of money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder. His legal team had filed 37 motions to dismiss, all denied. The trial was set for September. The king of Bakersfield would face justice in a federal courtroom, and the newspapers were already calling it the biggest white-collar crime case in Kern County history. Carson never returned from Switzerland. Scarlett showed Dalton an email she'd received from her former classmate. Brief, formal, but it ended with 2 words Dalton hadn't expected: "Thank you." "For what?" Dalton had asked. For not killing him, Scarlett replied, for showing him consequences without destroying him completely. Dalton thought about that, about mercy, about the difference between revenge and justice. On a warm April morning, Axel called Dalton into the church room. The full patch members were already seated around the long wooden table. Gunner, Reaper, Hawk, and 20 others. Men who'd once looked at him with skepticism now met his eyes with respect. Ghost, Axel said, gesturing to a chair at the table. Not the corner, not the observer's seat. A full position at the table. So, we've got three legitimate businesses now. The garage, the security company, and the construction contracts we acquired from Whitmore. I want you to coordinate operations. Make sure we're not stepping on our own dicks. Dalton stood, 16 years old, wearing his ghost-cut dressing men twice his age with decades of experience. He pulled out a folder he had been preparing for the past week. Here's the problem. Dalton began opening the folder and spreading papers across the table. We're running three separate businesses like three separate entities. No communication, no efficiency. We're leaving money on the table and creating vulnerabilities. He laid out organizational charts, flow diagrams, a reorganization plan he drafted. We cross-train between divisions, share resources, streamline accounting. We create a single operational hub that coordinates all three businesses while maintaining their individual identities. The room was silent. Men studied the papers. Gunner picked up one of the charts, examined it closely. Ghost, Gunner said slowly, this is solid work, real solid. We've been doing this ass backwards for years. Reaper nodded. Kid's right. We've been leaving ourselves exposed. This tightens everything up. Hawk, the quiet intelligence officer, spoke for the first time. This also gives us better cover for the less legitimate operations. Smart. Axel looked around the table. All in favor of implementing Ghost reorganization plan. 23 hands went up. Unanimous. Congratulations, Ghost, Axel said with a rare smile. You're now the official business coordinator for the Bakersfield chapter. Welcome to management. That evening, Dalton found Scarlett on the clubhouse roof. It had become their spot over the past few months, a place above the noise where they could talk without the weight of the club pressing down on them. She sat on the edge, legs dangling over the side, watching the sunset paint the Sierra Nevadas orange and gold. Mind if I sit? Dalton asked, even though he already knew the answer. It's your clubhouse too now, Scarlett said, patting the spot beside her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The kind of silence that only exists between people who've been through hell together. Finally, Scarlett spoke. What are we? She asked quietly. Dalton had been expecting this question for weeks, maybe months. We're family, he said carefully. That's not nothing. I know, Scarlett said. But is it everything that Dalton thought about it? About the girl who'd been the catalyst for his entire transformation, who'd visited him every day while he healed, who'd held his hand when the nightmares came, who'd taught him that being visible didn't mean being alone. Right now, he said, choosing his words carefully, family is everything I need. Maybe someday it becomes more, but I don't want to rush it. I don't want to mess it up by forcing something before we're ready. Scarlett was quiet for a moment. Then she bumped her shoulder against his. Fair, she said. For what it's worth, you're the first person who ever saw me. Not the president's daughter. Not the girl with the scary family. Just me. You did the same for me, Dalton said. Made me visible. We made each other visible, Scarlett corrected. They watched the sun set together. Two people who'd both lived invisible lives in different ways, finding understanding in the quiet. I'm starting something, Scarlett said after a while. A program for homeless youth in Bakersfield. My dad's donating space in one of the buildings we got from Whitmore. I want to create a safe place, food showers, resources, maybe even some beds. Dalton looked at her. That's incredible. I'm calling it Ghost House, Scarlett said. If that's okay with you, because you showed me that invisible people matter, that they're not ghosts we should ignore. They're people who need to be seen. Dalton felt something tight in his chest. I'd be honored. The next day, Dalton did something he'd been planning for weeks. He rode his Harley to the rail yards, to the exact spot where the rusted Ford Bronco had sat for 2 years. A different vehicle occupied the space now, a 1998 Honda Civic with a shattered windshield and two flat tires. And sleeping in the back seat was a kid, maybe 14 or 15, thin, dirty, invisible. Dalton saw himself in that car. He pulled a paper bag from his saddlebag. Inside, two thick sandwiches from the clubhouse kitchen, wrapped carefully, a bottle of water, $60 in cash, a cheap prepaid phone with important numbers programmed in, and his old battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. On the inside cover, Dalton had written a message. To whoever finds this, you're not invisible. You're just waiting for your moment. When it comes, be brave. When you're scared, be smart. And remember, the best revenge is becoming someone they can never ignore. If you need help, call the number in this phone. Ask for Ghost House, someone who was you once. Dalton set the bag carefully on the hood of the Civic, quietly, gently. The kid inside didn't stir. As Dalton rode away, he glanced in his mirror, saw the kid emerge from the car, sleepy and cautious. Pick up the beam, wouldn't read the note. Dalton didn't stop, didn't turn around, just kept riding. The cycle continued, invisible to visible, victim to survivor, alone to family. 3 weeks later, Dalton received a call on his clubhouse phone, a nervous teenage voice. Is this Ghost House? It is, Dalton said. You found the bag. Yeah, I don't know if this is real. It's real, Dalton assured him. Come to the address I gave you. Bring the phone. We'll get you fed, cleaned up, and figure out next steps. No cops, no system. Just help. The kid showed up 2 hours later, 14 years old, living in his dead mother's car for 3 months. Dalton recognized that hollow look in his eyes, the look of someone who'd learned to be invisible. Scarlett met them at Ghost House, fed the kid, got him a shower and clean clothes, listened to his story without judgment. And Dalton thought about how far he'd come, from that rusted Bronco to this moment, from invisible ghost to visible phantom, from nobody to somebody who mattered. On a perfect May afternoon, Dalton Reed cruised down Highway 99 on his 1987 Harley Sportster, the bike he'd rebuilt himself in Gunner's garage, bolt by bolt, wire by wire, gasket by gasket, earned through 600 hours of sweat and learning and proving himself. His ghost cut caught the wind, the leather already picking up the scars of the road, oil stains from garage work, wear marks from riding, the patina of a life lived fully. Scarlett rode beside him on her own bike, a sleek black softail she'd customized herself. Not girlfriend, not just friend, family, and maybe something more eventually. But for now, family was enough. Behind them, 20 motorcycles roared in formation. His brothers, Gunner with his wild red beard whipping in the wind, Reaper with his cold efficiency, Hawk with his quiet intelligence, and Axel Maddox leading the pack, the president who'd given a homeless kid a second chance at life. The highway stretched out endless and free. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose in the distance, snow-capped peaks against a blue sky. The heat of Bakersfield was behind them. Ahead was just road and possibility. Dalton thought about Edmond Dantes one last time, the Count of Monte Cristo, who'd waited 14 years in a prison cell for his chance at revenge and redemption. Dalton had only needed 6 weeks. But the lesson was the same. The best revenge wasn't violence, it was transformation. It was becoming someone your enemies couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss, couldn't erase. Dalton Reed was no longer the boy who slept in abandoned cars and ate from dumpsters. He was no longer invisible. He was the ghost of Bakersfield, tactical, strategic, dangerous in all the right ways, and most importantly, free. As the last rays of sunlight gleamed off his chrome exhaust pipes and the synchronized thunder of 20 engines echoed across the valley, Dalton smiled, not the smile of someone who'd won a fight, the smile of someone who'd won himself back. He'd been invisible long enough to see everything the world tried to hide. And now that he was visible, he'd use that vision to help others step out of the shadows. The ghost who refused to disappear, the phantom who changed the rules, the boy who became legend. Dalton Reed had found his place in the world. He'd found his family. He'd found his purpose. And nothing would ever make him invisible again.